Well, good evening, everyone. Wow, I love it when that happens. I'm Katie Conboy. I'm president of St. Mary's College, and I am very pleased to welcome all of you to Raise Your Voice, our annual Sexual Violence Prevention Symposium, and tonight's keynote speaker, Andrea Pino Silva. This event is sponsored by the President's Committee on Sexual Violence, and I'd like to thank that committee for their work. And I also want to give a special shout out to Liz Colston-Bauman, our Title IX officer, for her extraordinary efforts to plan this evening and the entire symposium. I think we should give her a hand. We do know that the topics that are going to be discussed tonight, although very important, can be difficult. So I just want to say, please take care of yourself. If you are in need of additional support, we have trained advocates from the St. Joseph County Family Justice Center. They're here and available to speak at any time. You can find them at the back of the auditorium. Now, this is the fourth year we have hosted this symposium. And I really feel that as a Catholic women's college and as the only women's college in Indiana, we should unequivocally be the conveners of this type of event. And we should be the leader in furthering discussions about sexual violence, its impact on survivors and on our culture, and how we can all play a role in ending sexual violence in our community. St. Mary's is committed to highlighting voices and stories that belong front and center. So tonight, we welcome Andrea Pino Silva to share her voice. Andrea Pino Silva is a public scholar on issues of gender-based violence, media framing of violence, portrayals of gender and sexuality and Latinx identity, and narratives of survivorhood. She is committed to bringing together grassroots organizing and authentic storytelling to build accessible social movements. Pino Silva believes in the power of stories behind movements and their unique power to mobilize everyday activism. In her words, quote, "Sharing your truth as a survivor is the ultimate form of activism because we live in a world that tells us to be silent." She is co-author of We Believe You, Survivors of Campus Sexual Assault Speak Out, and she is co-founder of the National Survivor Advocacy Organization, End Rape on Campus, where she worked for over 5 years to support students in learning their rights under Title IX and in changing their campus sexual assault and harassment policies. Her work and her personal journey are prominently featured in the film The Hunting Ground, which premiered at the 2015 Sundance Film Festival. This is the 10th anniversary of The Hunting Ground, and I want to acknowledge Andrea and all the survivors, particularly from St. Mary's College, who bravely shared their stories in the film. I also want to acknowledge Lizzie Seberg, whom we remembered and honored in a special prayer service this morning. Andrea is currently pursuing a PhD in American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I am deeply appreciative to have her on campus as our symposium keynote speaker. So please join me in giving a warm St. Mary's welcome to Andrea Pino Silva.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't believe it's been 10 years since I was in this auditorium. And I will say that being at St. Mary's was the warmest welcome that we did during our tour for the Hunting Ground. As you can imagine, at the time I was in my early 20s, and I had just worked on a film that was way bigger than I thought it would be, if I'm being fully honest with you. I had just finished my time at UNC, and to get to be here was surreal. And I will say too, and I will say this often, I think it says a lot to survivors, and I would say it means a lot to me that you all continue talking about Lizzie. Lizzie and I were the same class here. Lizzie would be 33 right now. And it's something I think a lot about because Lizzie should be where I am now, right? And it says a lot that you all talk about her, because I can't tell you how many campuses don't talk about survivors and their stories, and particularly those that aren't with us anymore. So I want to acknowledge the difficulty of having those conversations and how much it matters, I know, to the Seberg family, but also to other survivors, that you continue honoring her legacy and the work of survivors on this campus. So I wanted to acknowledge that. So a little bit of what to expect. I will not be talking about graphic nature of sexual assault, so I just wanted to note that. It's important for me to acknowledge that this is a space that I want folks to feel safe in, but if you do feel that this conversation is too much, please take space for yourself. But I will be talking a little bit about how I got here and what it's been like to be doing this work for over 10 years. And what my journey has taught me, I think particularly as we face some of the most difficult hurdles ahead. I think for me, when I came here, I thought a lot about how to make this talk inspiring, because things are really hard. I mean, I live in the DC area. Things are really hard in the DC area, in our neighborhood that's particularly where a lot of folks are feds. Things are really scary right now. And I would say that what my activism has taught me and what my neighbors' work has taught me is that this is the time to invest in our communities and to do the work, not when they tell us to do it, but when we feel it's right. So I wanted just to give you that little brief. So a little bit about me. So I am a little girl from Little Havana. I'm from the largest Cuban diaspora in the world. And I am the daughter of refugees and factory workers who came to this country with a dream, right? My grandparents worked in a shipyard and in clothing factories, and they bought a tiny apartment in Alapata, and they had a dream of sending their kids to school. My mom didn't get to go to college, but they wanted me to be that person. And I was the first daughter, and I was incredibly curious and asked a lot of questions when I was a kid, and I was so excited to be a student. And I want to talk about that specifically because my journey into this work is first and foremost the journey of a nerd, a person who asked a lot of questions and pissed a lot of people off when they didn't have answers. And when I was a teenager, I thought I wanted to go to Yale because Rory Gilmore went to Yale, so I wanted to be Rory Gilmore. And I ended up learning about UNC Chapel Hill because my AP biology teacher said, well, you know, Mia Hamm went there, and like, you like soccer? And I was like, oh, I guess I'll look at it. And my grandfather was like, I don't know, that school seems kind of cool. Like, it seems like they're really into politics, and you're really into politics. My grandfather was the neighborhood politician. He was like the mayor of the block, and he was the person who drove people to the polls. You know, civic action was really important to him, and it's something that really instilled in me a belief that I should do something when I think something is not right. So UNC felt like that perfect place. When I went to campus, it felt like people here wanted to do something. And I want to put in the backdrop too, because I was in high school when Barack Obama was elected. I didn't get to vote for Barack Obama because I was 16 years old and I was really bitter about it. But I was really energized by the amount of activism I was seeing amongst young people. And I think, like any millennial, I felt like this felt like a time where it was our moment to do something and to stand up. And I saw that activism at UNC. So I decided to move 800 miles away and go to UNC. And there's a photo of my parents being very sad. I was definitely crying a lot more than they were. But it meant a lot for me to be the first person to go to college. I mean, there was a lot of pressure as a first-generation college student. And not just for my family, but on myself. I mean, I felt like I was here for everybody in my family, and I felt like UNC was the perfect place. I had gotten a scholarship, I had seen a lot of other Latino students here, and I felt like this place was it. And I really dove into my time at UNC. I mean, I was so involved, I mean, way too involved. Someone had told me to back away, but I did not. I was involved in the admissions office, I was involved in the student stores, I was involved in every gender and sexuality group. I was involved in like the political advocacy group. I was doing canvassing. And for me, the extracurricular that really took it to the next level was being an RA. I dreamt of being an RA. I don't know why, but I was really into it. And I think for me, it made me feel like it was like the ultimate Tar Heel experience to get to be an ambassador of the university. And at the time, someone told me that, maybe you should get a career in student affairs. You seem to be really into this. And I said, maybe I will. And let's see what it's like for me to be an RA. And the week that I found out that I was an RA, I was on campus during spring break. It was right around Holy Week. I wouldn't go home to Miami for Holy Week. I also didn't mention this earlier, but I was raised Catholic. My grandfather was an usher until the year he died. And Holy Week was a really big deal for my family, but we couldn't afford the $800 ticket to go home for Easter because that was crazy. But that week, I stayed on campus, and that was the week that I was sexually assaulted. And I think for me, I didn't immediately think about it. I think that my inner hyper-focused college student was just like, I don't have time for this. I literally don't. I have to prepare for my exams. I have to decide on a major because I simply couldn't pick a major because I had 4 in my bucket list and I needed to not do that. So when it happened to me, I didn't think about it. I woke up the next morning and I was really upset. And I was upset, I remember, because I wasn't gonna make it to service that morning. And what was I gonna tell people about it? What was I gonna tell my friends? Because nobody was around me, so I was really curious about it. And I didn't have answers, and I think that's what scared me the most, right? Because moving away to college was hard, right? And I think particularly being involved on campus was my lifeline, right? And I didn't feel like I knew who I was, and I didn't feel like I had made the right decision. So I started talking to people, and they're like, oh, we don't really know what happened that night. So I pushed it away, and I didn't think about it. And that summer, when I started training to be an RA, I got involved in what was the beginning of a Title IX search committee. And I was put in this committee because I was the hyper-involved RA girl, and they're like, well, she has a lot of feelings and thoughts about UNC, so let's put her in that committee. And again, at the time, I wasn't involved in any sort of sexual violence advocacy. I had just expressed an interest. And when I was doing my RA training, and when I became an RA, I started hearing stories, and I started hearing people talk about experiences like mine. They didn't say it was sexual assault. They didn't say that they were survivors, because at the time we weren't using those words. We had trainings, but I think it was still something that folks didn't talk about. But I realized that our experiences were the same. And I want to stress this, that I don't think I would have come forward had I not heard other people's stories. And even in my own activism, the reason I came forward was because for me, my breaking point was the first-year students. My breaking point was the younger people that came on campus who felt lost and alone. And I saw my role as a staff member of the university, as an RA, to do something about it. That was why I got involved, right? And I think that story, you don't really see it in the hunting ground. I think you don't really see that. I didn't do this for myself. I did it because I felt that as a member of my campus, it was not okay for this to happen to so many people around me. So like I said, I was a nerd, big nerd. And I became obsessed with trying to understand sexual violence on college campuses, but specifically what it meant beyond the crime itself. My background is in political science, but I also, I've studied journalism and sociology and public health. And what for me was critical was seeing this as an epidemic that went beyond the crime itself and more as something that actually impacted the health of the campus, right? What I saw around me was that students were sick after experiencing sexual violence. And not just the students that actually experienced it, but their peers. Right, it impacted the way that we navigated it. And I would say particularly when I was a TA during COVID, I mean, the parallels of experiencing the pandemic and sexual violence were jarring. And I think it gave a very different perspective. But at the time, I started seeing the residents on my hall and my peers not be the same people that they were, right? So this is when I started to challenge this idea of how we talked about sexual violence, what the framing was. We are taught that it's a crime and it's what it is and it happens to a person who makes a mistake. But what I realized was that it was bigger than us, right? It was bigger than this concept of the perfect victim, of something that happened to somebody really far away, that it was something that was in the water at UNC. It was a part of the college experience, and that was terrifying. It was terrifying not just to students, but it was terrifying to the university to admit it. And I think that was what, for us, was a breaking point, what it meant. Because at the time, I thought, well, they just might not know that this is so bad, right? So naturally, as a student writing a paper, I had to inform them that this was really bad. And I chuckle about it because I quite literally presented this paper to the university during that Title IX search committee about these statistics. But specifically, 1 in 3, specifically 1 in 5. I would talk to the university, and I would say, I don't know if you all are aware how prevalent this is. And I would say, it's not just the 1 in 5 in this random study. I know the 1 in 5. Actually, it's more than 1 in 5. Most of my hall has experienced sexual violence. By the time that I finished my sophomore year, only 3 people hadn't. And I think that, a lot of them didn't want to come forward, and I didn't blame them. But these statistics were real people, right? And it wasn't just the women, it was also the men. There were men in my hall that had experienced sexual violence. And it's all I could think about. Right? It was all I could think about as an RA. It was all I could think about as a member of campus. But it became particularly jarring when I talked to other students of color. When I talked to students of color who didn't see themselves reflected in the media, who didn't feel like they could talk to anybody because there was nobody who looked like them on campus who could understand what they went through. And for me, this became a moment in which I thought about my own identity. And I thought about what it meant to be a Catholic Latina on campus experiencing sexual violence. My community didn't talk about this. My community didn't talk about sex. We certainly didn't go to Sunday school and talk about sexual violence. So this was why I didn't want to talk to anybody about it. And specifically, what it meant to not talk about the queer community. And I want to specifically talk about the queer community because when I was in college, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed my first semester. And we saw a wave of marriage bills when I was on campus. And there was a real chilling effect for queer students. And what I saw was that a lot of the survivors were queer students. They were trans students. And these were people that were not in the decision table. These were people that were simply being ignored, right? So when you started unpacking these more difficult intersectional conversations, the university didn't have any answers. And like I said before, I was a very frustrated young girl. And I was very frustrated that there were no answers to these big questions. So I started unpacking what it meant for us to not report, right? What it meant that nobody in my hall had reported. And what I learned in my research was that people simply weren't believed, right? And I will say in my 10 years of activism, I don't know of anybody who's had a successful criminal justice experience when reporting sexual violence, of those that have. I think Chanel Miller's is one of the more famous ones, and we all know how that ended up, right? And I think that the chilling effect of the pressure to report is real, right? And I think particularly in the college campus, there's the very real fear that you just won't get to be a student anymore. And that's what I learned from my peers. And honestly, like I said earlier, I just wanted to be a student. I just wanted to continue in my classes. I didn't want to think about it. And that's what a lot of my peers thought as well. So building a movement. I want to start off by saying that we had no intention to start a movement. You might not believe me, but it really wasn't the intention at all. I think when we were a bunch of students having these conversations, we didn't think this would be anything. But I think after having these months and months of difficult conversations around the epidemic of sexual violence on our campus, we had to think, we were thinking of what could change. We had done Take Back the Night, we had our speak outs. Something had to change. And for me specifically, it was learning about Title IX. Now I want to give a little background on Title IX. So I learned about Title IX in a political theory class. I literally read the assigned reading, and I learned about Title IX. And so I tell UNC, thank you, UNC. I learned so much about my rights thanks to your curriculum. And Title IX just happened to be one of the assigned reading in my political theory class. I read about Catherine McKinnon. I read about Title IX. And I learned that it was much more than a sports law. I thought Title IX was about sports, but what it really was about was education access. And this for me was key, because I learned that the spirit of Title IX wasn't just about making sure that we can make it here. It was that we had a right to access our education. And this is when I dug into specifically Alexander v. Yale. So Alexander v. Yale was the first lawsuit that used the framing of sexual harassment in Title IX. It was the first one in the 70s. And what they argued then was that they couldn't have access to education if they were facing sexual harassment as students. And what I realized was that, well, we were experiencing the same thing, and we were in 2012. So what had changed in all that time? And when I did some unpacking, I realized was that laws had passed and things had happened, but nobody talked about it. Nobody talked about these cases. You had to dig really deep in books to learn about Title IX and learn about that activism. The moment in which I realized that this was bigger than us was when I read Angie Epifano's letter about Amherst College in the fall of 2012. At the time, I was deep in my time as an RA. I had written so many care reports that I couldn't even think about it. Most of my friends had experienced sexual violence. And what Angie said was that it happened here at Amherst. And what Angie wrote could have been written at UNC. And reading about that, and reading about Alexander v. Yale, helped me understand that the point of Title IX was for us to feel safe in school and getting an education. And that was the breaking point for us. It was that we realized that Title IX wasn't being adhered to at UNC because we couldn't be students. Students were dropping out. They were changing their majors. They didn't feel safe being there anymore. So how could we access our education, right? So we decided to pick on that a little bit, and specifically what it meant to be experiencing institutional betrayal. And that was the key in the case of Alexander v. Yale, is that it wasn't just that assaults and harassment was happening. It was that the university knew about it, right? And after the months of having these conversations with UNC, I realized that the university knew about it and didn't want to do anything about it. And it wasn't just survivors, it was the faculty and staff members who came forward, who were ignored, who were not funded, who were not supported. This was bigger than us, so we had to do something about it. So what I realized was that we couldn't just talk about it amongst ourselves. We had to be public, right? So what I did was I studied every single case that had talked about campus sexual violence in the past 5 years. And what I realized was that the framing was always on sexual assault in the university, but I couldn't find the people. I couldn't find the survivors. I couldn't find the cases of what actually happened there. So we had to shift that. So we decided that we were gonna go public, we were gonna talk about Title IX, and we were gonna say that the issue of sexual violence was bigger than us. And we were gonna put a call out to anybody out there that they could do it too. And that was what made this a movement. And we, at the time, Twitter was our vehicle. Twitter is unfortunately a little less effective than it was back then. But at the time, I DM'd people who were activists. I would look up sexual violence. I would look up It Happens Here. I would look up Take Back the Night. And I would see if it was happening somewhere. And I would reach out to those students. And at first, I was reaching out to them cold. And then I started getting LinkedIn messages. I started getting messages on Instagram and Facebook of people who had experienced this. And they said, we want to do what you did. And I said, let's do it. And that's what we did, right? And I'll say what I said when my first ever on-camera interview. They said, so who are you? And I said, I'm just a 20-year-old woman taking on a 200-year-old university. And that's what we were. We were a bunch of 20-year-olds that were talking about the horrible things that happened to us and doing something about it, right? And I want to stress that I'm not remarkable in this case, and I don't think any of us really were. I mean, there were so many, we all had very different stories, very different experiences with violence and what brought us to campuses. But what we all cared about and what we all dreamt of was a world in which people talked about this, right? So we were gonna do everything we could so that people out there could find us and do what we did. And the movement was incredibly effective in that regard. What I'm most proud of is the fact that after President Obama launched a task force, we saw a surge of Title IX complaints. By 2016, we had 300 universities that were being investigated. That number has actually never come to that point anymore. It was directly as a result of the movement. The Department of Education simply didn't have the staff to deal with it. They couldn't deal with it, which was, it said just how much people didn't know about Title IX. People weren't filing complaints. A bunch of 20-year-olds did this, which is remarkable, right? And I say this again because while a lot has changed, people simply didn't talk about this 10 years ago. And hundreds of 20-somethings said, we're gonna make them talk about it. And that was really at the core of our movement. So 7 years later, and again, we didn't expect that our complaint would go anywhere. UNC was found responsible for violating Title IX. And it was, at the time, one of the largest fines ever levied by the Department of Education. It had a rippling effect. It caused a wave of investment in addressing sexual violence. But I think for us, it was validating, right? And I even struggle with the way that I say we won, right? Because do you really win when you have a culture of sexual violence that is very much still active on college campuses? But I think for those of us that work in movements, it says a lot, and it feels pretty good to know that you are 25 years old and a 200-year-old university has to pay over $1 million because they didn't listen to your little report about statistics. But it meant something. It meant something that this is in history, that it was in history, that we were right, and that they couldn't ignore this anymore. So things got even more intense after the Me Too movement. And I want to say, too, that I definitely saw a major shift from our early days to the Me Too movement and what it meant to have a public reckoning around sexual violence. It meant something, and the students are among the first post-Me Too generation. And the conversations around sexual violence were much more mainstream. And it made a big difference in the way that we talked about it. But I wouldn't say that it's specifically, our movement had already established itself before it. What we saw was more of a kind of broader commitment and more of a mainstream conversation around sexual violence that I think to this day has definitely still impacted the cultural lexicon. So where we are 10 years later, you know, it's crazy to think that it's been 10 years because I think I still think about what it was like to be a student and what it was like to be scared and what it was like to make the big risk and risk my scholarship and risk getting kicked out of campus and risk my family being really mad at me for doing this work. And a lot has changed, right? I would say that the biggest thing that I can't not talk about is the weaponizing of laws, right? And I want to say, too, that it's not surprising that Title IX and the sexual violence activism has been weaponized. It was actually being weaponized when we were still doing it, right? We got the doxing threats. We were harassed by men's rights activists. We had people who created Wikipedia pages of us and wrote a bunch of slander in there. I had people who would call my high school teacher to make sure that I was actually from that high school. I mean, this level of harassment is not new, right? I think what is becoming difficult is when the weaponizing of our activism is institutions of power, is in our federal government. And I will say that there's a lot that we don't know. But I think that what we do know is that we have had these difficult moments before. And we always knew that Title IX wouldn't be the solution to ending sexual violence. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit more. We knew that the challenge of addressing sexual violence was bigger than Title IX. It was bigger than the hunting ground. It was bigger than our movement. Because we knew that the biggest issue we had to tackle was how people saw sexual violence, right? How people saw the perfect victim, how people saw the crime of sexual violence. And these are things that are still going. They're still going on, right? But I think that they're not not new enemies. They're not new challenges. These are things that we saw then. What's different now is that we have a language to talk about it. We have a language to talk about how the perfect victim isn't real, and how the media has gone after survivors, has gone after their activism, and has painted a picture that it simply doesn't happen to good Catholic girls, to people who do what they're told. We know that it's not true because now we have stories. Now we have evidence that the movement taught us better. And specifically, what it means that people are not here, what that means. And I want to point that out specifically because I think that so much of this work, what has really humbled me is how many survivors didn't make it, right? And I don't just mean because of mental health, and that's a big one. There's a lot of survivors that we've lost in the movement because there simply wasn't a refuge, there simply wasn't support. But specifically what it meant that a lot of survivors died before they were believed. And I specifically want to talk about Faith Hedgepeth. Faith Hedgepeth was a year younger than me at UNC, and she was a victim of domestic violence, was also sexually assaulted. And they actually just arrested somebody only a few years ago. It went on over 10 years without any sort of movement on her case. But the amount of shaming around Faith, the amount of silence, and again, when I say specifically how much it matters that you all talk about Lizzie, people don't know who Faith Hedgepeth is. People don't talk about Faith at all. There's a contingent specifically of Native American students who talk about her because she was a Native American student. But if it wasn't for them, people wouldn't know about her. And when I was a TA, I talked about Faith, and people simply didn't know that this happened. And they're like, how would I come to this campus and not know that a survivor was murdered here? And I said, well, the university didn't talk about it because technically it happened off campus. So really these tough conversations about how survivors are blamed and how certain stories are talked about, certain stories are forgotten. These challenges are not new, but it's important for us to keep thinking about the work that's ahead. So where we are now, I thought a lot about what it meant to talk about hope here, right? Because I know it seems, now that I've been talking about something so serious, that I don't have hope, but I do, right? I have a lot of hope for where we are because, like I said before, these challenges, they're not new. I know it seems like they're new and they're scary, and I don't know what's gonna happen with the federal government. I don't know what's gonna happen with this country, but I will tell you that our communities were just as important then as they are now. The power that you all have in your communities, the ability to have these conversations and be here, this is what got us through 2012. This is why we filed the complaint. We filed the complaint because I had a professor who believed in me. I had a community advisor who believed in me as an RA. I had people in my campus who thought I was telling the truth and supported me. That's why I came forward. I didn't come forward because I read stories or because I felt that I would be believed. I came forward because my community made me feel like I could. So I want to talk a little bit about that specifically because even though the laws have changed, even though we don't know what's going to happen, the fact that survivors spoke up 10 years ago, the fact that you can look up campus sexual violence and learn about the hunting ground and learn about what's happened says that our movement worked. Because what I see now in the coverage of sexual violence is it's not talked about a single case anymore. It's not talked about a certain person's experience, at least not on college campuses. What we didn't go away. And even though we might not have a Department of Education that wants to investigate our complaints, even though it might feel like everything is lost, it's not, because there's an entire generation that's behind you. And that is something I'm really proud of. So what does it mean to go beyond resilience? And I want to push on resilience specifically because I think a lot of people say I'm resilient, okay? And I will tell you, I'm really not resilient on a Monday morning. I'm really not. And it's, I think particularly this year it's really hard to be resilient when the snow has not melted. I'm not gonna lie as well. And I laugh about it because you kind of have to laugh when people say that you're resilient, because how many things does a person have to go through, really? You know, the tests are just too much sometimes. And you really shouldn't have to go through all of that, right? And I say this specifically to students because, students just signed up to be students, right? They signed up, they paid tuition to be students. And to experience sexual violence, that wasn't part of the curriculum, right? You shouldn't have to be resilient. You shouldn't have to experience that, right? So what does it mean for us to go beyond expecting resilience of survivors and showing up as a community and being there for them? What does care look like, right? I think for a lot of stories that you read in the media, you think of care as in a person maybe sees a therapist, maybe they report to the police, and maybe they push through and they graduate, right? But the truth is that the impacts of sexual violence are so much bigger. The root causes of them are so much bigger than just the interpersonal. There's the bigger inequity, education inequity, economic inequity, the lack of access to health care, people being able to actually get the care after they experience violence. You shouldn't have to search a website to try to find out who's going to believe you and support you. You shouldn't have to get a loan to be able to pay for a therapist after you experience sexual violence. But unfortunately, that's the reality for a lot of people, right? To tell a survivor that they need to heal sometimes just doesn't give the bigger picture of all the barriers that a survivor has to go through to heal, to access the care, to be able to stay on campus, right? And it also puts this undue pressure on the cycle of activism to make us care, right? What is a cycle of activism? Something that in my 10 years of doing this work, I see over and over again is there's a cycle on university campuses, right? Students come forward, they do a bunch of calls for the university to do something. There's maybe some sort of scandal, usually some sort of high profile case. Then the university does something, and then they have a committee or a task force, and then nothing comes out of it, and then they do it all over again, right? And that is the case at a lot of universities, right? And also that's the case at my alma mater at UNC, right? I've seen a lot of versions of UNC. I've seen the UNC when I was there. I've seen the UNC after UNC was held responsible for violating Title IX. I've seen UNC during COVID, in which they closed the Women's Center and only had one person responding to sexual violence cases for a campus of 30,000 students. I've seen a UNC that now has a violence prevention office, right? And I wish that I could say that I expected UNC to be better every time I visit, but I don't, right? Because what I see is that the cycle of activism is what leads to investment. And it's not fair to staff and faculty who are there beyond 4 years, staff and faculty who do unpaid labor. It's not fair to community members who do a lot of work on the campus. It's not fair to campus police who are certainly not equipped to handle sexual violence. And it's not fair to students who just want to be students, right? And I will say that, again, this is what inspires me about St. Mary's is that you all don't rely on that cycle, at least not to me as an observer. The fact that I can come here in 10 years and see that you have more resources, it's great, right? It's great to see that because it's honestly, it's ahead of the curve of a lot of colleges. So I want to unpack a little bit about what commitment looks like, right? So compliance, I have to laugh about compliance because I tell people that 10 years ago, quite literally the Title IX coordinator was a person living in a basement. I kid you not, that was a Title IX coordinator. At UNC, it was some random person named Anne who was in a dark corner in a building at UNC, and I don't think Anne knew that she was a Title IX coordinator. Literally, I think she didn't even have it in her desk. And we're really different than that, right? That's not where we are right now. At least I hope not at most universities. But I think a lot of universities, they have that Title IX coordinator. They talk about Title IX. They have a policy. They report crimes. And they require students to take an online training that they're probably just skipping through and or using ChatGPT to answer, right? That's what it is. We all know what those trainings are. That's not what a culture of commitment is, right? And what I see at St. Mary's and what I see at a lot of universities is this kind of broader impact, this broader commitment, right? And I want to say too that there's a lot that St. Mary's can still do because that's the journey of this work, is there's a lot of learning and unlearning, and you could always be doing more, right? But it says a lot that you all have this conference. It says a lot that you all talk about sexual violence. It says a lot that I've heard of a lot of people talk about being survivors, right? It says a lot that you feel comfortable doing that, right? And I see that at the schools who have that culture of commitment, right? Who have that culture that they don't wait for a high-profile case to do it. They're actually committed to talking about it. And I also see this kind of higher standard of talking about cases as being intersectional, right? It's universities that bring in your LGBTQ center. It's universities that bring in their accessibility office and talk about disabilities and how to support the whole student. It's universities that talk about this beyond April, right? That's this culture of commitment that talks about this issue when it's not just someone breathing down your neck to make sure you're talking about it. So what is beyond resilience, and what is this culture of commitment? It's comprehensive health resources. It's accountability, and accountability is really important because sometimes you have to learn those hard lessons, right? And I talked about this in my talk earlier, is that, you know, it's having those hard conversations with staff and faculty who maybe didn't say the right thing. Staff maybe have a lot of learning to do. It's having the conversations with students who maybe weren't the most supportive. It's having those conversations of how you can do more. It's comprehensive trainings, right? And that's something that we talked about this morning too, is that I think that there's a lot of people on campuses that want to do more, right? But you get that one consent training when you become a student here. You get the one mandatory reporting training when you become staff or faculty. But then sometimes folks don't know what it looks like when you're actually doing your role, right? Like, how do you know how to support a person, right? And I think particularly for students, because a lot of students might not know this, but you often end up being that caregiver, right? When I was in our RA, I got maybe 20 minutes training on violence, and I got 3 whole days on marijuana. I knew a lot about reporting marijuana, but I didn't know anything about how to support my fellow students. So I had to learn that. It was unpaid labor, right? It was work that I had to do outside of my time as an RA, right? So when a university invests in this kind of training, offers this kind of, continuing education so that folks can learn more about it, it shows that there's a culture of commitment, a culture of support that goes beyond just basic compliance. And it's kind of looking at support that looks at the more holistic student experience, right? And I talked more about it this morning too, but I think a lot of folks, they focus on adjudication, they focus on reporting, but students are still students after they experience sexual violence, and particularly because most students experience sexual violence in their first 2 years. What about the rest of their time on this campus? What about the time that they struggle to finish their lab, right? And that's when it's the point that they have to talk about it. What does it mean to look at academic support as an extension of supporting survivors, right? Because I think that a lot of times we don't talk about it, right? We don't talk about what support looks like behind confidential reporting and psychological services, which again, are important. But the truth is that a student is probably more likely to need academic support than they're gonna need counseling for the remainder of their time on campus. So why aren't staff and faculty more engaged in that conversation of response? What does it look like to provide those resources before a person needs them, right? To meet survivors where they're at rather than expect them to be resilient and ask for that help. So it means also asking the hard questions, right? Does my university committed to this? Do students feel safe coming forward? And I don't just mean students who look like the perfect victim, but LGBTQ students, students who are disabled, students who might know their attacker. Do those students feel safe coming forward? Do they feel safe coming forward if their stories are messy, they don't know what they did? Are student campaigns welcome? Are they encouraged, right? And I will say I do see that here, but I don't see that on a lot of campuses. Sometimes students are seen as adversarial, as the enemy of the campus, rather than as an integral part in making sure that the university is a safe and welcoming place. So, stepping up when institutions don't. And I want to say specifically that when I'm referring to institutions, I'm referring to our legal system and I'm referring to our federal system. Because again, I can't come here and not talk about that, right? I won't deny that I'm scared too, right? I think that for those of us that have worked in the movement, sometimes we have moments where we wake up and we're like, what was the point of it, right? I won't lie to you. I think there's some days where I'm really interested in seeing the new flowers and spring is here, and other days where I'm like, I'm not gonna wake up. And it's been hard, I think, particularly for some of the allies that we had in the Department of Education. It's really hard, right? But I will say that, and I spoke to Liz, I kept asking Liz this question. So like, what's the pulse check like? I'm just curious, how are things in South Bend, what's it like? And they're like, oh, like, we're not feeling a lot of that despair. And I'm like, wow, that would be great, honestly. I'd love to not feel despair. But I think it says a lot, right? And I will say too that I have been to 48 states. I'm missing Alaska and Hawaii. If you know anybody there, let me know. And I have seen some of the most incredible work in tiny colleges in the middle of nowhere. I tell people that I had a great experience at University of Central Missouri. I talk about St. Mary's. I talk about Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas. I talk about these small schools, right? And what I see in these communities is community stepping up when funding isn't there, when the laws aren't there, when their states aren't there. The amount of incredible support I saw in Texas Tech in a community that had been targeted by homophobic attacks and racial hatred and targeting of women. I saw a community step up, a community have those hard conversations, a community come together, right? And that's where we have to be right now, right? And we talk about this in the DMV as well, is that, again, so many of my neighbors are federal employees, and when we have those moments of despair, but I've been so inspired to see how many people have been creating resources, how many people have been offering legal services, immigration services, pro bono counseling for people who have been laid off, support services, people who have to leave an abusive spouse, even though they've lost their job. This amount of activism, it's been happening, right? And it continues to happen even when the laws are not there to protect us, right? And I will say, if I had to say one thing about reflecting on 10 years of activism, is again, we never thought Title IX was gonna save us, right? And I think you might see the hunting ground and think otherwise, and I do have a tattoo of Title IX, so there is that. But we're friends, Title IX and I. But I would say that it had its flaws, right? I think like any law, right, like any institution, particularly institutions who ignore systemic violence, we knew that there would be problems. We knew that interpretations would vary. We knew that we might not always have an ally in these institutions of power, right? Title IX was a tool that we needed then, but we knew that it wasn't the solution, right? The solution was our activism. The solution was the accountability that we created in our campus, right? So before UNC was found responsible for Title IX violations, what held UNC accountable was the students, literally. We had one person in the Women's Center, we had a hole-in-the-wall LGBTQ center, we had, again, the person in the basement who was Title IX coordinator. There was no investment in this issue. There was no investment in this conversation. And overnight, before any sort of Title IX violation, there was an investment, right? And there was investment because the students demanded it. We saw dips in applications and admissions. We saw students talking about it during admissions visits, which there is no way to piss off a university more than a controversial conversation during an admissions visit. And I would say, it's funny because one of the schools that really got me was Dartmouth. Dartmouth was a passion project of mine, specifically because the level of just complete denial was insane. Dartmouth had the lowest number of applications that year, an Ivy League university. And I think something's actually happening at Columbia now as well. So I think it says a lot about when you don't stand by your students, people don't come. They don't come. They don't invest in you, right? So do something about it, right? And I want to say again, that didn't happen because the federal government told UNC they had to. That happened because the community said they had to, right? And I've seen this, and again, even here at St. Mary's, you all are doing this because you want to be doing this, because the campus is invested in it, right? There's nobody breathing down your neck right now telling you have to do it or else you're gonna have to pay $1 million fine to the federal government, right? It says something that this everyday activism, this accountability is something that is keeping the conversation alive, right? And that is what we need to invest in when we have these adversarial moments ahead of us. Because again, we don't know what we're gonna experience in the next 4 years. We don't know what's gonna happen. We don't know particularly what this generation is gonna have to face when they leave college, right? We don't know that. But I will say what I know as no longer the youngest generation of activists on this issue, which is weird to say, is I'm here for those students, right? And that's what matters, because I was able to do it because I spoke to people who were the elders in the movement. I spoke to people like Daisy Hernandez, who wrote Colonize This, right? Daisy, who reached out to me after she read about what happened at UNC and continues talking to me, right? I did this because of the work of Polly Murray, who was talking about doing this work in the South, right? That's why I did the work that I could do, because I read that other people had done it, right? So what it means for us to be visible and continue to do this work and continue to show up and continue to demand something better, that's what's gonna get us through this. So I want to end something with something I always say, is that I know that I'm not the only survivor in this room. And I always talk about this because I think that everyone's in a different part of their journey, but I want to acknowledge that I have people here that I know that share an experience like mine. So I want to end this conversation in saying that to the survivors in this room, I see you, I believe you, it's not your fault, and you're not alone. Thank you. Oh, it's you all. Should have said something earlier. Am I in the middle? Wherever you are. Nobody wants to be in the middle.
Hello, my name is Caitlin Sizemore, and I'm a senior studying speech-language pathology and gender and women's studies. And I'm also an RA. I am the Title IX student worker, one of the academic liaisons for student government, and this is my 3rd year on the President's Committee on Sexual Violence.
Hi, my name is Valentina Rubio. I'm a senior and I'm studying psychology. I'm a student athlete here and I play lacrosse. I'm also on the Student Athlete Advisory Committee, and this is my 1st year on the President's Committee for Title IX.
So as we begin the Q&A, please remember to text the question using the number printed on your program. So we wanted to start off by thanking you so much for coming back to St. Mary's. And as you mentioned, you were here 10 years ago when The Hunting Ground first came out. How did that movie change your life?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah, there we go. I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty loud, so. How did that movie change my life? You know, honestly, I really didn't realize it was going to be that big of a movie. I'll be fully honest with you. I think that my parents also didn't realize it was that big of a movie. We had some honest conversations. You know, The Hunting Ground was a really unique experience because it was an accident. One of my residents went to the screening of The Invisible War, which was the film crew's previous film. And they're like, wow, this is some crazy stuff happening on this campus. And like, my RA is like super involved. We should talk to her. And they're like, okay, we're going to talk to this college student, whatever. And at the time, we had this conversation, and the film crew was just mind blown by this campus sexual violence epidemic that they hadn't heard about. So they decided to kind of tag along to see if we weren't just a bunch of weirdo students, you know. When we started doing much more public-facing work, because this was in, I think it was in late February, so we had filed the complaint, and there still weren't a lot of national articles. I think the New York Times article was the big one that I think got the film crew realizing just how big of a movement this was. But at the time, and I said this at lunch earlier, is that we actually didn't know that we were the main story of The Hunting Ground until like a week before the film premiered. We had no idea. And they were really secretive about it. And you know, we watched the film and we're like, okay, wait a second. We did not know that we were like in this entire movie. It's like and if you've seen the film, there's like weird moments where I'm like randomly cracking jokes with my parents, and I'm like, I didn't realize that was gonna make it in the film. This is embarrassing. And I really don't watch this film often because nobody wants to see themselves when they were 20 years old. But I think I just didn't realize how big it was gonna be, right? And I don't think I even realized how big it was until we were at the Oscar stage. I kid you not. I still can't believe that happened sometimes. That was also surreal. That was crazy, where we got a call. We're like, do you guys all wanna come to the Oscars? And we're like, okay. And we all like snuck on the red carpet. It was a whole thing. And we weren't supposed to be there. We were not supposed to be there on the red carpet. And I think for a lot of us, you know, I laugh because again, we were just so young and dumb. Just, we got like cornered by like Brad Pitt's private security or something. It was a whole thing. Just crazy young people. But I think it was a surreal experience because, I mean, this was like, no one wants to be famous for like the worst and that's ever happened to them, of course. But I think for me, I was just so proud to see these fellow young people who were just like, yeah, we did this. I mean, I think you're both holding the like sadness and the anger of this terrible thing happening to you, but also like realizing that as normal 20-somethings, you got people, the whole country to talk about it. And I will say too, I didn't talk about it this time, but I talk to people around the world. I mean, I have a strong coalition of folks in Spain that I talk to often, that they're doing some incredible work. I mean, people in Australia who've done some incredible work. I mean, this film and our work, it went beyond the US. And I think that's sort of that humbling moment where you realize that, the things that you were talking about in your dorm room that adults didn't really think were that big of a deal. I mean, it got people to do something about it. So I think that sort of realization is a pretty surreal one. Sorry. You're fine.
The next question is, did you get any pushback from your family on doing the documentary?
I mean, that's also a big question. Okay, listen, I am from a Cuban Catholic family. Duh. I mean, I went to Catholic school, and honestly, I thought that like my biggest star moment was probably gonna be like a tie between my confirmation and my quinceañera, and I thought that was like the end of it. I think my parents knew that I was a talker. I probably would get in trouble. They thought maybe it was a politician, and they were like, well, at least we're prepared for that. There'll be elections and stuff. I don't think my parents had any idea this was gonna happen. And I think sometimes we look back, like, remember when that happened? That was crazy. Remember when like my buddy was like, oh, I saw your daughter on CNN, and I was like, that was weird. And I think I had people from like elementary school that were like, I was just watching the Oscars and you were like definitely there with Lady Gaga. That was
Holding her
not
hand.
what I was expecting. That was not expected. That was not in the, she just grabbed my hand and I lost it.
We were talking about that before and we were like,
It was, it was just like, I'm telling you, it was just such a weird experience. And I think again, people were like, oh, you were so calm about it. I was not calm about it. I was not calm about being at the Oscars. I think I could be in a movie, but then the Oscars was like the moment where it was like, this is just too much. The Oscars are like really tiny too. So like you're on a stage and you've got a bunch of really famous people staring
just
at you.
looking at you.
Yeah, like Rachel McAdams was there. I was like, she's so cool. Oh man, it was just like, this is incredible. I mean, like Angelina Jolie, I'm like, wow, I just can't even handle it. So I think that I think for a lot of it is surreal, and I think for my family, and I was talking to some folks earlier today, I think I've gone through these moments of, when you're like an adolescent, and I don't just mean a teenager, I mean you're in your early 20s, you're like, my parents don't understand me, they don't get me, and I think I went through a lot of that, I think particularly with the Catholic Church and my upbringing, because I was in a pretty conservative Catholic church. And my family, we just like didn't talk about stuff. Mm-hmm. And it drove me crazy, right? So then when this happened, and I told my parents, my family just didn't say the right thing, and I just like lost it. Like I couldn't handle it. And, just because I was really being an overachiever, I also came out to them as queer like that same year. It was just a lot for my parents. And they just, like that, the queer thing, the sexual assault thing, the movie, it was just a lot. And I remember being so upset with how my family wasn't talking to me about it. And I'm like, oh, like, you know, like this is a huge deal. And I remember like my dad taking me to lunch and him being like, you know, I am so proud of you. And I think having that conversation made me realize that, you know, our parents aren't perfect, but I think that my family has been unwavering in their support. And I, you know, I think as I get older too, like, I just feel so lucky that I have a family that is so supportive and affirming. And like, and my grandfather, before he died, he had this photo of me with Barack Obama. It was like his thing.
That's awesome.
My grandfather was really obsessed with presidents, and he had like all of them displayed. And he had a photo of me with Barack Obama. I don't think he really understood why I was there. That was also a surprise, by the way. I did not know Barack Obama was going to be there the day that I took a photo with him. That was also a surreal experience.
That's amazing.
But, you know, that was, my family was just so proud of me and continues to be so proud of me. And I think that, you know, I think it was definitely a shock for them, but I just feel so lucky to have a really supportive family.
That is really awesome. I totally understand. Like, I come from a Latinx community too, so I totally get the not talking about it. Like, you kind of say it and then you're like, okay,
Yeah,
someone say
any
something,
reaction, anger,
anything.
like, you know.
But thanks for answering that. What change have you seen in the last 10 years regarding sexual violence awareness?
Yeah, you know, I think that I think particularly recently, I think there's moments where I'm like, oh man, like this is still so bad, right? And I think particularly the semester that I was a TA and I had 60 students that I was responsible for. I mean, it was really jarring to hear that this was still happening, right? I think that, you know, I sometimes get lost in those moments where I think that, you know, and I said this when I came forward, is I was doing this for the classes that were beyond campus. I think I had said the class of 2020, and then I realized that was 5 years ago. But, you know, I had said like an arbitrary year, and I was like, I'm doing this for these classes, the classes that are coming forward after me. And I think that while sexual violence is very much still a problem nationwide, globally, I think what's different now is that we're talking about it, right? We're talking about the issue of sexual violence. You can look on the internet about campus sexual violence and learn about it, right? And I think that films like The Hunting Ground were a big part of that, but I think it's the movement that really got us there, right? This amount of transparency did not exist 10 years ago. I mean, I think about our Take Back the Nights and our Survivor Speak Outs and how most people were anonymous. And of course, we still have plenty of people who don't feel safe coming forward, but you have more people who feel safe coming forward. You have more people who want to talk about it, who own their experience. And I think that that amount of transparency, I don't see that going away. I see it continuing. And I think a lot of that has to do with community stepping up, but I think it has to do with people being visible, right? And I think that's why being visible was important to me and to other people that were in the movement.
Love that.
I have a follow-up question to our previous question. What were some of the reactions from fellow students or administrators when The Hunting Ground first came out?
I don't know, man. I think about this and so I will say, I had the benefit of not being a student. I cannot imagine what it would have been like to be a student when that film came out. I know a little bit from Sophie Karasik was in the film because Sophie was a student when that came out. And I think Sophie was actually, she might have been the only one who was still a student. And I know it was really difficult for her. But I will say that honestly, we got more pushback when we were just regular old activists on campus. I mean, the amount of just hatred that we got was bad, right? And I would say that it was surprising, I think for me, again, because I was the nerdy overachiever kid. okay, it's not what I expected to hear from you when I asked for an extension on a blog. You know, but then I had a white male professor who was really affirming and supportive, and not only was he great as a professor the semester that I was active, but he like invited me to a graduate seminar who was like, you're really into media framing, you're really into movements, like you should study this. And I think that, you know, the responses were varying because, again, we definitely had pushback, but I think there was also a lot of surprising support, which, I mean, it's the reason why I was able to keep doing it.
I know you mentioned your professor. Is there anyone else like in your life that when you were getting this pushback that kept you going and kept you like seeing the goal at the end?
You know, I would say that it was very lonely in the beginning. You know, I think back to those days and it just feels so long ago. It was hard to have friendships. And I won't lie and say that I lost a lot of friends. And I lost a lot of friends not because they didn't believe me. It was because like I didn't have the emotional capacity to be a friend. Being a friend takes a lot of time and effort. Yes. And I mean, forget dating. I mean, literally, like just having friends was a lot of work. And, you know, I didn't feel like I was a really good friend then. I mean, I had my best friend from high school who I like just couldn't talk to about stuff because she like kept asking me questions and asking how she could support me. And I just like couldn't stop talking about this law I learned about. And that's really all I talked about. So I would say that like, it was a very isolating experience. I think what really got me through it, I mean, it was the fellow survivors, for better or for worse. I think a lot of us were all a little obsessed and focused, but having that community was really important. I think reading about the works of other feminist activists, I mean, that felt like my community then. It really, like I said, it was a very isolating moment. But I would say that when we did file our complaint and we did come forward, I mean, the amount of energizing community that we had in our network. I mean, we had this like Facebook group, which was, I mean, we had, I think at some point we had like 10 people, and I don't even know, I think we had like 10,000 people by the time that we finally closed it, because I think it got to the point where like we can't manage this anymore. But you had, I mean, it was crazy. Like you had all these people around the world. And you know, it's funny because I'm still friends with so many of them, people that I only met once or twice. A lot of them have kids now, or they've moved on, and it's just so funny because sometimes we forget how we became friends. We're like, oh yeah, we did all this stuff forever ago. But I think that level of community was incredible. And again, when talking to activists who did work before us, like they said, like we couldn't have done what you did if it weren't for the fact, I mean, we could have done what you did, but we couldn't because we had no way of connecting. Like we wrote letters to each other. But I think having social media and being able to connect online, I mean, we were able to build those communities when we felt the most alone.
What are other ways college students can be activists on their campuses?
Yeah, so I want to push a little bit on activist, right? So I think a lot of people think of activists as, you know, you plan your protests, you do your sit-ins. This is all activism, right? This is all important. But I think that, you know, this idea of everyday activism and what it looks like to show up, I mean, I think that there's different types of activists, right? The person taking the meeting notes during your student meeting is also an activist, right? They're really important. They're the person who keeps the group together, right? I think that there's a lot of pressure of activism being very public, very heroic, but I think that the biggest thing that you can do is be committed to talking about this, right? Being committed to talking about this issue, being committed to imagining something better, right? I mean, you all have some really great student groups here, but I think really being committed to creating that student, like, you know, I just recently was in a job where we did a lot of work with human rights defenders and a lot of work with USAID. And one of the last projects I worked on before they closed our grant was specifically on people doing gender violence work in Ethiopia. And I remember having this conversation with this woman who, she was a recent mother, and she was saying how they would get together after dropping their kids off and just talk about like what else they could be doing, right? Wow. And writing some blogs on like what new moms can be doing to support each other. talking about events that they could have where people can just come and talk about what they were experiencing. And, this is activism, right? And this is the kind of stuff that gets you through the difficult days, right? It's thinking about creating that community beyond your sexual assault awareness months, beyond your moments that the conversation has started for you, and actually creating those spaces. And I would say, you were talking about being a student athlete. It's also having those communities within your communities, right? Having those conversations within your communities, because the experience of sexual violence as a student athlete is very different.
Yeah.
Right? And I worked with many students who were survivors and were athletes, and they felt very isolated because some of them simply couldn't make it to group therapy because they had practice.
Yeah.
Literally.
The schedules for student athletes are insane. Yeah.
I had one student who really wanted to come, and she literally couldn't because the only group therapy was during her practice, right? So she felt really alone and isolated, right? So she was super committed to kind of bridging that gap and creating the spaces within student athletes, right? And I think that sometimes it just takes that one student to spark that conversation. But I encourage students to think about what you're not seeing, right? If you're not seeing these intersectional conversations, right? You're not seeing a specific area. Let's say you want to talk more about specifically the intersection of faith. Having those conversations, saying, I want to talk about what it's like to think about sexual violence on Holy Week, what it means. Right? We're encouraged to think during Lent. We're encouraged to think about the struggle, right? And I have a friend who just finished Ramadan, and she talked about specifically what she was thinking about during Ramadan. And she thought about what her role was in the resistance, what she was doing, right? And she was super committed to her ancestral cooking. That was her struggle. Her struggle was I'm gonna perfect this, not just because the aunties are judging me, but because this is my resistance. I came to this country as an immigrant. This part of me is not gonna be lost, right? And I think it's not dissimilar when talking about sexual violence. Is what are ways that you can step up in your role and be part of the conversation in a way that maybe isn't already being talked about?
I'm actually gonna ask advice. As a student athlete, I feel like sometimes we're in that environment where it's we're practicing, we're playing, we're kind of in a less serious mode. How would you recommend to student athletes, how can we bring up this conversation when it's we don't want to be so serious, but this is a serious topic that needs to be talked about?
I don't think anyone wants to be serious. I mean, honestly, it's just, I always say it's I'm not a person who takes herself that seriously, which maybe doesn't make sense with who you've seen of me. But honestly, a lot of these hard conversations are just had among friends, right? And I think that from what I've heard of a lot of the student athletes that I've worked with, it just kind of came with this was really important to me, right? Do you all just want to come and watch this film and talk about it?
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes it was literally just that conversation, right? I think for a lot of folks, it usually was in reaction to an incident happening, right? And I have seen moments in which groups have come together. I've seen sorority step up. I've seen teams step up. But sometimes they don't because they're scared. But I would say sometimes it's just having that conversation, right? And literally just being this is really important to me, and I'm just curious if you all want to learn more about it.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that folks are going to want to do it. Honestly, life is busy and you've got things going on. But I think just sometimes telling a person that it matters to you is enough for them to care, right?
Okay.
I think you'll be surprised how many friends will show up. Right? I have a friend who's really into stand-up now because that's how we process trauma. They're doing literally a fire and fed stand-up. That's the DC area for
Coping
you.
with humor.
It's just what it is. And she's doing it, and I was I didn't realize she was into stand-up, but I was I'm gonna go because she's my friend.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it was a cold call where she's whoever wants to come. And she's been pleasantly surprised. And another friend who got really into going to a piano bar, and it's really embarrassing to ask friends to show up to something, but people care about you, and they're gonna go. And I think that I will say that I had a lot of friends who maybe didn't say the right thing when I first came forward, or who didn't understand my obsession, right? I will say that. But I have this one RA specifically, and she and I are very much these enemies. She was also a first-generation college student, was also on scholarship, and literally was so over being an RA. And I would hate me too, honestly. This girl was way too into this job. And she was really mean to me when I was a student. And then when we were touring the hunting ground, she was in a grad program in Boston, and she was like all the way in the front. And I hadn't talked to her in years. And she's like, I'm just so sorry for being a jerk. And I just want you to know that like what you did was incredible. And like I learned a lot from you. And like I want to be a therapist now.
Wow.
You know? And I would never have expected that at all from her. And I think people have really surprised me in the years that I've done this work, how many people just like really admire you and they want to do more, but they just don't know how to get involved.
And then I know you said that this person didn't say the right thing. Like, how would you like advise to those friends who didn't say the right thing and like they feel bad about it, like just coming up and saying like, I'm sorry, like how would you tell like how to react to it or how to get the trust back of the friend?
Yeah, you know, honestly, I think that you know, we can all do better and be more humble.
Yeah.
You know, the process of activism, of being involved in this work is a process of learning and unlearning. I mean, there is so much stuff I have had to unlearn in my life or think about it in a different way. And, you know, I think it's part of what makes this experience so incredible. And I think a lot about how thankful, I know it sounds weird, and maybe I'm only talking to certain folks in the audience, but as a person who wants to be a parent and hopes to be a parent soon, I am so thankful of all the learning and unlearning I have done before I'm a parent. It probably doesn't matter to you. It's okay. You've got some time.
I hope I have some time.
You know, I have so many of my friends who are survivors who are parents now, and we keep talking about this and about how like we are navigating these conversations so differently. Like we're thinking about how to be gentle, how to encourage. We have one a baby in our block who is like really confident, and we had this conversation, her parents and I, and then she's like, you know, I'm balancing what it means to keep her bravery but try to keep her safe, and that terrifies me, right? And I think about that too when I speak to students, because like I don't want y'all to be scared. I want y'all to be activists and be brave, but I also want you to take care of yourselves, right? And I think it's hard to balance that because for a lot of people, it's a journey and you got to figure it out, and you got to have those moments where you're like, I am really burnt out, and you have to get there on yourself. But I think sometimes it helps to hear from people that they've been there too, right? So I think I like to see myself as that person who is there to listen, but also remind someone that, like, you know, we go through this too, and we're all figuring it out. I've said a lot of things I regret. I've made a lot of mistakes. Like I said, I think particularly when I think back with like my family, and I think about how, frankly, mean and bratty I was as a kid. I mean, like, come on, man, like that was just mean. But you know, I mean, you're a teenager, and you just want your parents to be better, and you think you know it all. And I really did. I mean, I really thought that I was like this like genius kid who like, you know, I'd gotten a summa cum laude or whatever. I was like, I knew it all. Like, what do my parents know? And you know, I didn't offer them the grace, right? And I think specifically of my grandparents who had a middle school education, and like those guys just knew so much. They still do. I mean, the amount of things that they learned just being fishermen, working in the shipyards. I mean, these are lessons that made me who I was, who I am. And I didn't appreciate it at the time. And it doesn't mean that I'm a bad person. I just had to realize that I had to kind of unlearn that own judgment that I had of my family for not being the way that I was.
That's great. Thank you.
Right, this will be our last question. What should predominantly white institutions do to help support diverse survivors?
Yeah, this is a great question. You know, I would say that when we think of DEI specifically, because that's what we're talking about, mainstream, I think there's this mainstream belief that DEI is new and DEI is not new. Perhaps it wasn't being talked about that way. And you know, I think specifically of people like Polly Murray, who were doing this incredible work in the South. And Polly Murray could have left the South and, you know, gone to New York or DC, but Polly decided to stay in Durham, North Carolina. And the work that communities of color do for movements and have done in our institutions, I mean, this has been going on since institutions have existed, right? But I think oftentimes white leadership doesn't think about their contributions as being essential to the blood of the university, right? And that, I think, is a tough
lesson that universities have to work through. And I think thinking about what it means to center, what one may consider to be the most marginalized person on campus, right? If you create a space in which that person is supported, everybody is supported. So why wouldn't you meet them there, right? We think about this idea of an access ramp, right? So I live in Maryland, and Maryland is getting this huge metro, the Purple Line, and my neighborhood has no sidewalks because it's an old 1940s neighborhood. And we now have sidewalks because we have a metro and it has to be ADA accessible. And now I'm looking at how many strollers can now be on the sidewalk, how many dogs are walking on the sidewalk, how many elderly people can walk now and they couldn't walk before. And I just keep thinking, well, why didn't we think about doing this before? I mean, everybody needs this, especially during the blizzard. I mean, like, you literally couldn't leave your house, right? And that's the way you want to think about, this idea of centering the margins, right? Is that rather than think about, well, we're not doing enough for Black students, we're not doing enough for Latinx students, we're not doing enough for queer students. Like, what would it mean for us to center these experiences that are often forgotten in the leadership table, right? I think particularly when we think of writing policies of planning events, like, bring them there, right? And that is something we talked about at UNC, is that there would be, a student orientation fair, right? And like nobody thought to bring in the LGBT office. No one thought to bring in our religious leaders. Nobody thought to bring in our accessibility services. They learned about it through students, right? They weren't invited in the conversation, right? So what states at universities is that you have your experts on campus, right? Again, like you don't have to have a focus on DEI because you already have experts of color on your campus. You just have to treat them as experts.
That was really good advice.
Thank you for sharing. Well, if everyone would please join me in thanking Andrea for spending her time with us today. And thank you all for participating in this special event at St. Mary's College, and we hope you join us next year, April 13th, 2026. And please make sure to visit the resource tables outside in the lobby and some refreshments. And Andrea will be joining us for a meet and greet and to sign books.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.